Here, I'm not in favor of the Dismantle Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Act, or what it maybe would more aptly be called the dismantling any semblance of support or opportunity for certain American acts. We know who those Americans are, Americans who have not enjoyed centuries of unfair advantages by keeping others enslaved or segregated or disenfranchised or incarcerated or redlined or gerrymandered or excluded by law. Americans who've lived with disabilities or had their relationships criminalized or their gender expression demonized. If we're being honest here, this bill, which will wipe out every diversity, equity, and inclusion program in our federal agencies, plus those who contract with us, plus those who receive grant money, plus our schools, is nothing new. This is just the final piece of a decades-long obsession with targeting and dismantling anything that might give marginalized people a fair shot, including DEI programs, which honestly started the second the Civil Rights Act passed. Policies like affirmative action and diversity, equity, inclusion are the closest things we've had to the mythical bootstraps that some of my colleagues insist historically and currently harmed communities need to pick themselves up by. After centuries of efforts to keep us out of schools and universities, from jobs and elected office, Republicans targeting these policies are no accident. Why do predominantly conservative white men believe that the success of a black person or the opportunity or access of a black person is an existential threat to them?
Representative Summer Lee broke down the reasons she's against J.D. Vance's bill to ban diversity, equity, and inclusion programs and funding in the federal government. Since the MAGA movement effectively convinced folks that the most disenfranchised and discriminated against groups in the country somehow run the country, it's worth it to listen to why DEI practices are necessary. Representative Melanie Stansberry joined her.
We just had a letter introduced into the record from the Heritage Foundation that is supporting this bill because of misguided efforts to essentially stoke segregation, division, and create a victim-oppressor narrative, essentially, is what this letter of support says. But what is particularly peculiar about this massive bill that's been introduced, and I want to note that the co-sponsor of this bill, or this primary sponsor of this bill in the Senate, is Mr. J.D. Vance, our vice president-elect, is it literally, as the title says, is about dismantling diversity, equity, and inclusion programs in the federal government. It revokes executive orders, it amends the Civil Rights Act, and it amends other parts of the federal code that protect our federal employees.
Why do they feel the need to amend the Civil Rights Act? Every February when we celebrate Black history and politicians submit their stories of Black folks' contributions to society, they act like civil rights are something that they're in favor of. But it goes away when legislation is on the table.
And then it has this peculiar section that the ranking member talked about, which is actually essentially creating lists of federal employees and contractors that would never be eligible to work for the federal government again. Now, we have a word for that in common parlance. We call it blacklisting. And blacklisting comes from the 1950s when, here in this House of Representatives, there was a committee on un-American affairs that was convened under Joe McCarthy. The purpose of that was to purge the federal government and to accuse federal employees and blacklist them from future federal employment. So I'd like to say, welcome to the new House Committee on Un-American Affairs and to the new McCarthyism, because we have arrived here today with this bill. So let's talk about what exactly is trying to be accomplished by this bill.
Weird how the blacklisting section of Vance's bill to wipe out diversity requirements within the government, which is supposed to represent all Americans, wasn't advertised as a major driver in their decision to push for this. This is the party that complains about a rigid Democratic base that participates in cancel culture, but they want to create blacklists for employees and contractors that don't comply. Now, watch Representative Lee tell a couple more truths in response to the generic claims that diversity equals racism.
DEI is not given any unfair advantage that society itself does not already confer on certain Americans. It merely exists to ensure that all other people, that women, minoritized folks, queer folks, disabled folks, have the same opportunities to succeed and thrive in our workforce and our schools as people who have not had those opportunities systematically and legally stripped from them do. Is our country not greater when all of us have opportunities to succeed and contribute and survive. Our success and our survival as a nation is bound together. Diversity, equity, and inclusion programs only exist to band-aid over decades, hell, centuries of discrimination against people's skin color, their religion, disabilities, gender, or sexual orientations, you name it. Contrary to Republican conjecture, remedying past discrimination is not, in turn, a discrimination. What DEI does not do is give some kind of magical pass to better jobs, like some of our colleagues are implying. That middle word, equity, does not mean more than or better than. It means treating people fairly and impartially. It means working to fix generational and systemic discrimination to the betterment of all of us in all of our institutions.
So can anyone that's in opposition to diversity claim that the country doesn't have a history of discrimination? Many times we choose to avoid even accepting it because it would naturally force us to take seriously how our past legislation and natural division along racial lines affects our laws and society today. A simple declaration that we've come a long way in itself admits that we had some savage beginnings. Are we claiming that women, minorities, and queer folks have never been kept out of professional and educational settings, even with our parents and parents? No one can deny America's discrimination. So to keep from having to answer for it, political folks have made the traditional targets the bad guys.
Republicans are trying to bastardize the term DEI to be a slur. When Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson was up for confirmation and when Vice President Harris was added to the ticket, they called them DEI hires. They want you to believe that a Harvard graduate with over 20 years of experience, who happens to be a black woman, is not qualified, but a Fox News personality is qualified to run the Department of Defense, and the WWE executive is qualified to run the Department of Education. Let's be real. There is an attempt to create a direct correlation between our race, being a black person, and our qualifications. So much as to say that there is no way to be a black woman. There is no resume that a black person could have that would qualify them unless that black person is a Republican. And there is a quota there. And while all of this has happened at the top level of our government, I can promise you these same things are happening on every single level of government and private sector. But those people don't have a national platform to speak out against discriminatory treatment. My Republican colleagues have got to stop punching down on already marginalized communities and face their own fears of a level playing field privately. It's shameful.
Now, I know it's uncomfortable to hear that our purposeful blind spots on the origins and development of the country preyed on certain people that were physically and legally suppressed from participating in the American dream that we all brag about. We can't let it go. We just have to stop acting like it never happened because it's allowing for it to continue to happen right in front of us. Or the very likely assumption can be made that the plan is to promote it and attempt to take us back to the times some of us reminisce on being the best days America had.
This is not about qualifications. This is not about having a qualified federal workforce. This is about laying the ground for the purge that they plan on January 20th and in the days afterwards. And we know that because the very organization for whom the chairman just submitted this letter of support is the Heritage Foundation, who wrote Project 2025, which gave us the blueprint for the purge itself and what they are planning inside every single one of these agencies. So we need to be clear-eyed about what this actually is and about what is trying to be accomplished and why 4 weeks before we're about to adjourn for the holidays, the Republicans are bringing this bill to a markup without an actual hearing. This is modern McCarthyism. They are preparing for a purge. They are going after members of the federal government who are advancing because they are people of color, women, LGBTQ+, other members of our community who have been excluded systematically from participating in federal service and leadership positions, and then they're going to put their own unqualified loyalists in there to take out our federal workforce.